It is national institutions which form the genius, the character, the tastes and manners of a people, which make it itself and not another people, which inspire it with that ardent patriotism which is based upon customs that cannot be uprooted.
So wrote the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 1762. His words expressed an idea that was soon to dominate the politics of Europe and much of the world beyond. The idea of nationalism. What are the elements that make a group of people into a nation? Most historians would agree on these four: geography, race, language, and culture. Let us consider each of these separately. The most basic element of national unity is a common piece of territory. Men like to think that certain natural boundaries, such as rivers, mountains, and seas, are ordained by God as frontiers for their nation. Such boundaries often support this idea by being easy to defend and hard to breach in attack. Common racial origins and characteristics are also closely associated with the idea of a nation. People tend to join with others like themselves, against those who are different. Before the 19th century, cultured people of many countries often preferred to use a language other than their own. In the Middle Ages, such people spoke Latin. In the 17th and 18th centuries, they spoke French. Often they despised their own language. But language is one of the few factors that clearly sets off one group of people from another. With the growth of national consciousness, people began to see in their own language an important national characteristic. Culture refers to the history, customs, manners, art, literature, and folklore common to a particular set of people. Identification with these elements usually breeds a strong sense of loyalty to the people and to the nation with whom one's culture is shared. Nationalism took a very long time to develop in Europe. For many centuries, men had narrower concerns and outlooks than allegiance to the broader idea of a nation. Following the breakdown of the Roman Empire in the 5th century A.D., Europe reverted to a primitive agricultural existence. Barbarian marauders roamed unchecked. Everywhere, men sought protection from the ravaging hordes. From this need for protection, the system known as feudalism developed. In return for work, taxes, and personal loyalty, strong warlords and barons could provide protection. Men's lives were centered around narrow communities. As the Middle Ages progressed, religion became a dominant force. The Catholic Church served as a unifying influence in Europe. Throughout the world, dividing lines were drawn according to religious civilizations, not according to nationalities. Church Latin was the language used by the educated classes in all parts of Europe. Native or vernacular languages were thought of as much less important. By the 16th century, however, both the Renaissance and the Reformation had lessened the influence of the Catholic Church. Politics, science, literature, and the arts, trade, exploration, and discovery. These were the activities that began to engage the full attention of a reviving Europe. The invention of the printing press had made it possible for books of all sorts to be circulated among a wide audience. More and more books came to be written in vernacular languages, rather than in Latin, a development which produced the first stirrings of national awareness. Early in the 16th century, an Italian diplomat and writer named Niccolo Machiavelli began to raise his voice in the spirit of nationalism. Machiavelli appealed for a strong man, an ideal prince, to liberate and unite all of Italy. But Machiavelli was ahead of his time. Though Europe was split up into different countries ruled by kings and princes, the boundaries of these countries frequently changed and cut across racial, cultural, and linguistic lines. It was still some time before nationalism would begin to make an impact on the map of Europe. The idea of modern nationalism took root in the 18th century with the writings of Rousseau.
It is the test of education to give to each human being a national form, and so direct his opinions and tastes, that he should be a patriot by inclination, by passion, by necessity. On first opening his eyes, a child must see his country, and until he dies, must see nothing else.
18th century German philosophers introduced the idea of cultural nationalism. Johann von Herder was one of the first to talk about the essence of a people that made them capable of producing particular customs, habits, and language. The philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, on the other hand, emphasized the role of the state. For Hegel, the past history of a people culminated in the state and its laws. The state therefore represented the nation, and its laws and interests were more important than those of the individual. As the 19th century began, Romanticism became the leading cultural movement in Europe. Romantics sought a new freedom of expression in the arts, and many of them eagerly supported longings for national freedom. Nationalistic ideas, in turn, became increasingly romantic. Literature, art, and music were seen as a means of expressing a nation's innermost soul. But the achievement of nationalist aims required more than romantic ideals. It needed political action, and often revolution. Europe was ruled by a group of autocratic kings and princes who had no interest in the nationalistic desires of their subjects. The resulting nationalist struggles in Europe were to take two basic forms. Where people of one nationality or culture lived under several different governments, they sought a unified country under their own control. By contrast, in a country where several different nationalities lived under one government, each wished to break away from that government and set up a nation-state on its own. Nationalism as a political force first appeared in connection with the French Revolution, which began in 1789. Before that date, upper-class European culture had been cosmopolitan in character. Cultivated men of all countries traveled extensively and acquired the same artistic taste and moral outlook. As late as 1772, Rousseau observed,
"There are today no longer Frenchmen, Germans, Spaniards, even Englishmen. There are only Europeans. Provided they find money to steal and women to corrupt, they are everywhere at home."
Until 1789, there was even some confusion as to who were the French. Traditionally, the French nation was identified with the king and the first and second estates, the clergy and the nobility, who kept the third estate, composed mainly of peasants, in feudal bondage. But the peasants and the bourgeoisie of France, who possessed no privileges, regarded themselves as the true French people. The French Revolution began as a conflict between the estates. But the French nation was born when the elected deputies of the Third Estate proclaimed themselves a National Assembly.
The denomination of National Assembly is the only one suitable, because the members who compose it are sent by nearly the whole of the nation.
As the National Assembly gained more power, it swept away aristocratic privileges and brought the Catholic Church with its great wealth under the control of the state. A host of symbolic acts marked the dawn of a new age. The blue, white, and red tricolor was adopted as the symbol of the new nation. Rousseau was claimed as its spiritual father. Trees of liberty were planted by the populace. The new leaders hailed the common people as idealized representatives of all the national virtues. Attendance at schools and festivals, service in the National Army, and increasing administrative centralization all contributed to the growth of a common national consciousness. A new national patriotism was expressed in heroic terms by revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre.
Yes, this delightful land which we inhabit and which nature caresses with love is made to be the domain of liberty and happiness. I am French. I am one of thy representatives. O sublime people, accept the sacrifices of my whole being. Happy is the man who is born in your midst. Happier is he who can die for your happiness.
When the French National Assembly declared war against Austria in 1792, the populace was filled with patriotic fervor. The war inspired the famous decree of August 23, 1793, calling on all Frenchmen to lay down their lives in defense of liberty.
The young men will go forth to battle. The married men will make arms and transport food. The women will make tents, uniforms, and will serve in the hospitals. The children will prepare lint from old linen. The old men will gather in the public places to rouse the courage of the warriors, to excite hatred of kings, and to preach the unity of the Republic.
Elsewhere in Europe, the Irish were the first nationalists to be inspired by the French Revolution. The Irish House of Parliament, seen here, was a corrupt and unrepresentative body, more ready to serve its English masters than to alleviate poverty at home. In May 1798, insurrection broke out against the English. The Irish rebels had hoped for assistance from the French, but when this failed to materialize, they were defeated after 6 weeks of fighting. In France itself, the revolution had taken a new turn. By 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte was in command of France and her armies. Under his rule, the French pledged to
extend help and fraternity to all peoples wishing to recover their liberty.
As a result, between 1799 and 1815, Europe was almost continually at war. At first it seemed that nationalism throughout Europe might triumph under Napoleon. In Italy, people celebrated Napoleon's creation of a new Italian republic in 1802, with himself as president. Polish soldiers willingly served in the French army following the founding of the short-lived Duchy of Warsaw in 1807. The duchy gave new hope to Polish nationalists after nearly 40 years of seeing their country partitioned among various nations. In Germany, Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine, created on the conquered ruins of the Holy Roman Empire, reduced the number of separate German states from over 300 to 39. Some Germans welcomed Napoleon with enthusiasm. Hegel regarded him as Germany's deliverer and described him as the world's soul on horseback. The composer Ludwig van Beethoven originally dedicated his Third Symphony, the music we've been hearing, to Napoleon. But though Napoleon and his armies could change political boundaries and support new rulers, they could not create real nations. So long as the French retained power, the people of these countries were denied their freedom. Many nationalists throughout Europe soon lost their admiration for Napoleon. In some countries, nationalists gained their inspiration from resistance to Napoleon. These paintings by Goya commemorate a Spanish uprising against the French in 1808. Goya's series of engravings entitled The Disasters of War conveys the full strength of Spanish nationalist feeling against the French. Goya himself wrote the captions. In Russia, too, nationalism found expression in resistance against the French. In June 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia and pressed on to Moscow. But he was forced to flee the city when it was burned to the ground, almost certainly by Russian patriots. With the approach of winter, the ill-equipped French army was forced to retreat. Only 20,000 French soldiers survived the Russian campaign, out of a grand army totaling nearly 500,000 men. For Napoleon, it was the beginning of the end. Following Napoleon's final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, the old order reasserted itself at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The statesmen who met there were determined to crush the seeds of nationalism and rebellion that Napoleon had sown in Europe. To one cartoonist, the Congress of Vienna was the dancing Congress, because the statesmen changed partners and alliances at will. But much that Napoleon had achieved in the name of nationalism was altered. Italy was again divided into a number of states, some ruled by Austria. Belgians were ruled by Dutchmen, and Poland was once again partitioned between Prussia, Austria, and Russia. The German people were still divided among a host of separate states. Nationalism had not yet triumphed in Europe. The statesmen who met at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 had seen enough of the new spirit of nationalism to be thoroughly frightened. They had come to associate nationalism with revolution and with the expansion of French military power. The rulers of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, who together formed the so-called Holy Alliance, were determined to maintain an iron-fisted conservative rule. They wanted to reorganize the map of Europe to guarantee their autocratic power, without regard for the nationalistic claims of their subjects. Austria in particular felt that too much nationalism could destroy her empire. Let us see why. The Austrian Empire consisted of a large number of different nationalities. Following the Congress of Vienna, it included present-day Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, as well as parts of Poland, Italy, Germany, Romania, and Yugoslavia. The Congress of Vienna also set up a German confederation, consisting of 39 states with no central administration. Some of these states were part of the Austrian Empire, but the most influential was the independent kingdom of Prussia. Prussia herself had gained part of Poland through the settlements at the Congress of Vienna. The rest of Poland remained divided between Austria and Russia. Italy was again split up into separate states. The northern provinces of Lombardy and Venetia were returned to Austria. The Pope resumed control of the Papal States, and separate dynasties were re-established in other parts of the country. But the Congress of Vienna could not put the clock back altogether. Nationalism in Europe had been given an irreversible inspiration, first by the French Revolution, then by Napoleon. Nationalistic feelings could be temporarily suppressed, but they could not be destroyed. For the next 33 years, nationalist movements achieved little in Europe. This was mainly due to Prince Clemens Metternich, the Austrian Chancellor, who was determined to maintain the arrangements set up at the Congress of Vienna. But not even Metternich and his friends could keep the spirit of nationalism from bursting forth. During the 1820s, a nationalist movement in Greece inspired tremendous emotion and sympathy throughout Europe. Men of all countries volunteered to join the Greeks in their struggle to be free from Turkish rule. The English romantic poet Lord Byron wrote,
"The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea. And musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free. For standing on the Persian's grave, I could not deem myself a slave."
The French romantic painter Eugene Delacroix painted this moving allegory of Greece expiring on the ruins of Missolonghi, the place where Lord Byron died of a fever in 1824 while preparing to fight for the Greeks. In 1830, revolution moved closer to the heart of Europe. This painting by Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People, celebrates the Paris Revolution of that year. While the 1830 revolution in France did not have specifically nationalist aims, it sparked off a successful Belgian revolt against Dutch rule. In that same year, the Poles also rose against their Russian overlords. But the Polish nationalists were ruthlessly crushed. Thousands of Polish exiles fled to France. The composer Frédéric Chopin expressed a defiant Polish nationalism in his music. A contemporary wrote,
"And as this Polish national spirit now goes about in the black garb of mourning, it stirs us even more deeply as we find it embodied in the sensitive artist. If the powerful autocratic monarch knew how in Chopin's compositions, in the simple melodies of the mazurkas, a dangerous enemy threatens him, he would forbid the music. Beneath the flowers in Chopin's work, there are hidden cannons."
The clamoring voices of national frenzy echoed and re-echoed across Europe.
France was born and started into life at the sound of the cannon of the Bastille. I have known misfortunes, I have suffered, it has scarcely moved me to tears. But when I have thought of the folk, I have always had to weep in the depth of my soul. I am one with the folk and God. The war which we are carrying on against the Turk is a national war, a holy war, a war the object of which is to reconquer the rights of individual liberty, of property and honor, rights which the civilized people of Europe enjoy today. Rise, Magyar, for this thy land calls to thee. The hour is at hand. Are we slaves or are we free? This to ask, the choice to thee. By the God of the Magyar, do we swear, chains no longer will we wear.
National fervor and emotion continued to mount, and in 1848, the dam burst. A tide of national and liberal revolts swept across the whole of Europe. These revolts were sparked off by an uprising in Paris in February 1848. The revolutionaries forced King Louis-Philippe to abdicate and declared a second republic. The French revolt inspired nationalists and liberals throughout Europe. In southern Italy, after 16 days of fighting in Palermo, the Sicilians won a constitution from King Ferdinando of Naples. In the north, Piedmont was also granted a constitution by King Charles Albert. News of the Piedmontese constitution inspired the Lombards to revolt against the Austrians. The citizens of Milan seized ammunition from the armory and set up barricades in the streets. In Venice, a new republic was proclaimed. The spirit of revolt swept onto the heart of the Austrian Empire. In Vienna itself, students and intellectuals assembled in the streets, determined to wrest power from the hands of Metternich and the aristocrats. Metternich, scorned by the populace as well as by this cartoonist, was forced to flee from Vienna. Soon after, the Austrian emperor fled to Innsbruck with his family. The Hungarians were quick to take advantage of Austria's troubles. In March 1848, Louis Kossuth, leader of the Hungarian nationalists, made a famous public speech. Kossuth demanded that the Hungarian parliament, or Diet, have the right to administer all the land within the historic borders of Hungary. Preoccupied with revolts in Vienna and Italy, the Austrian emperor agreed. Also in March, a revolt broke out in Berlin, the capital of Prussia, where citizens demanded liberal reforms. The revolt in Berlin was quickly followed by uprisings in other German states. In May 1848, a parliament representing nearly all the states of the German Confederation met at Frankfurt. Its intention was to form these states into a single German nation under a single emperor. But the 1848 revolutions, which had begun so promisingly, all ended in failure. In France, the Second Republic was forced to condone a massacre of workers by the army. Louis Napoleon was then elected president. Soon afterward, he abolished the Republic and made himself an emperor. In northern Italy and in Hungary, Austrian military forces eventually regained control and carried out a brutal repression against the insurgents. In Vienna, the government took advantage of disagreements among student and working class revolutionaries to reimpose its authority after laying siege to the city. In Berlin, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV also played on middle-class fears to repress both the workers and the revolution. Prussian and Austrian troops then dissolved the Frankfurt Parliament, ending its hopes for German unity. Although the 1848 revolutions had failed, it took only 25 more years for many of their nationalistic aims to be achieved. In Italy, where republics had been crushed and revolts put down, There had been one permanent gain from 1848, the constitution granted by King Charles Albert in Piedmont. Within a dozen years, this constitution was to be the legal basis for a new Italian nation-state. 3 men were principally responsible for the unification of Italy. The first was Giuseppe Mazzini, who believed fervently that the hoped-for nation-state should be a republic. In 1831, Mazzini founded a revolutionary society known as Young Italy.
Young Italy is a brotherhood of Italians who are convinced that Italy is destined to become one nation. Young Italy is republican.
Mazzini had become head of a triumvirate which administered Rome when she became a republic during the 1848 revolutions. After the Roman Republic was crushed, Mazzini went into exile, where he remained for the rest of his life a staunch Republican. The second great figure of Italian unification was Count Camillo di Cavour, the liberal Prime Minister of Piedmont, who hoped to unite Italy under a liberal monarchy. The third figure was Giuseppe Garibaldi, a military adventurer who had originally supported the Young Italy movement. After 1848, Garibaldi increasingly supported Cavour in his desire to unite Italy under a monarch. Garibaldi, too, had gone into exile following the collapse of the Roman Republic in 1848. During the years that followed, he amassed a loyal band of followers, the 1,000 Redshirts. In 1859, Garibaldi and the Redshirts returned to Italy and attacked Austrian troops in the north. Garibaldi's men then sailed south and won an important victory in Sicily, while Cavour marched Piedmontese troops through central Italy. Finally, the 2 leaders joined forces on the mainland. In March 1861, a united Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed, although the Austrians retained Venice until 1866, and Rome remained under papal control until 1870. One of the main questions concerning German unification was whether Austria should be included in a unified German nation. If Austria was included, all the Germans in Central Europe would be unified. But other national groups within the Austrian Empire would also be brought in. To exclude Austria, however, would be to exclude the most powerful German state in Europe. During the first half of the 19th century, Austria and Prussia struggled for supremacy within the German Confederation. This cartoon depicts a conflict over customs duties. Although Austria was more powerful, their rivalry prevented any agreement on the terms of German unification. Then, in 1862, Prussian policy came under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck. Through cleverly isolating Austria by diplomatic means, Bismarck was able to achieve what the men of 1848 had failed to bring about, a united Germany with Austria excluded. Bismarck's policy was to provoke Austria to the point of war, which came in 1866. Prussia defeated the Austrians after 7 weeks of fighting, and Austria agreed to withdraw from German affairs. In 1870, Bismarck provoked the French to declare war on Prussia. The Franco-Prussian War aroused tremendous national feeling in Berlin, where enthusiastic crowds rejoiced in the streets. Having defeated the French and the Austrians, Prussia was now the dominant power in Germany and one of the strongest in Europe. This strength enabled her to proclaim a united German Empire in January 1871. Austria's defeat by Prussia had repercussions throughout the Austrian Empire. The Hungarians were now able to force their claims. By the Compromise of 1867, Austria allowed Hungary to become an equal partner in a dual monarchy. Here the Austrian emperor is crowned with the sacred Hungarian crown of St. Stephen. Meanwhile, the Turkish Empire in the Balkans was beginning to crumble. This empire, like that of the Austrians, contained a mixture of national groups. As Turkish military strength waned, these groups were encouraged to struggle for their independence. The first blow had been the success of the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s. Now in the second half of the 19th century, strong nationalist demands were heard in Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and elsewhere. A temporary settlement of the complex Balkans question was finally achieved in 1878 at the Congress of Berlin. Romania, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Serbia were made independent. Bosnia and Herzegovina were taken from European Turkey and given to Austria-Hungary, while parts of Asiatic Turkey went to Russia. The Turkish Empire had grown too weak to prevent its dismemberment by the great powers of Europe. While some nationalist aims were satisfied by this settlement, others were left unfulfilled. After 1870, nationalism came to play an increasingly abrasive role in European politics. With the struggles for national unity largely over, European nations turned against each other. One important area of conflict was overseas colonies. European nations vied with each other to see who could build up the largest empires in Africa and parts of Asia. As the prosperity of Europe came to rest more and more on industry, each country tried to protect its national interests by imposing tariffs against its European competitors. Great Britain and Germany engaged in an intense rivalry to build a national fleet. As one country seemed to draw ahead, the other rapidly took steps to surpass its rival. A full-scale arms race developed in Europe. Ironically, one of the last remaining struggles for national unity lit the fuse under the great power rivalries of Europe. Although Serbia had been made independent in 1878, many Serbs still lived within Austria-Hungary. Serbian nationalists, such as these women training to use rifles, hoped to liberate them. In August 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated the heir to the Austrian throne, the Archduke Francis Ferdinand. The chain of events which followed led directly to that greatest of national conflicts, World War I.